Well, to me, it was the most unusual thing that would never happen in another million years, because never would they allow one person, well, I was a teenager, to fly a bomber.
It was a very odd setup, a typical British one of, well, here's a crisis, let's see what we can do about it.
You know, it's amazing what you can do when you're young, isn't it?
During the Second World War, the challenge of moving ever-increasing numbers of fighting aircraft from the factories to the squadrons of the RAF fell to the men and women pilots of the Air Transport Auxiliary, or ATA. Famed for ferrying anything to anywhere, the work of the ATA represents a unique episode in the history of aviation. From teenage novices to First World War veterans, the ATA attracted an extraordinary collection of flying enthusiasts from across the free world. These were the unsung heroes and heroines of the skies, the forgotten pilots of the Second World War. It may be more than 60 years since many of these ATA veterans last climbed into the cockpit of a Spitfire, Lancaster or Hurricane, but time has not dimmed their enthusiasm for taking to the skies.
My haircut, if I know. Absolutely. I did.
Each year, the RAF lay on this special memorial flight from RAF Lynham in recognition of the vital role these pilots played in supporting their service during the Second World War.
I don't think I understand all that more. But that lot's more or less my friends.
It's more your cup of tea.
ATA pilots clocked up an astounding 742,000 flying hours, undertaking more than 308,000 ferrying missions, and between them they mastered the controls of up to 147 different types of aircraft. Each pilot kept a tally of his or her personal total.
How many aircraft was it that you'd flown?
260 Spitfires.
260 Spitfires by the age of 22, and learned to fly at the age of 18, and learned to fly 6 aircraft in the space of a year. I mean, that just wouldn't happen these days. Fantastic. And they've obviously opened the doors for female pilots, you know, throughout, which is brilliant. I think it's great.
So how did young women like Diana and Maggie come to be flying the most powerful fighting aircraft of the day? The origins of the ATA can be traced back to the heady days of pre-war flying, when all you needed was a flat field and a fine day to take to the skies.
Well, the great thing about flying in the 30s was that there were no regulations at all. At least I didn't know of any. And we just, if we wanted to fly somewhere, we'd get out a map and fly somewhere.
It was marvellous, really. You just hired an aeroplane if you hadn't got one, and off you went. I don't remember ever telling anybody where you were going or when you were coming back. You know, nobody bothered.
Away from the fun and frivolity of club flying, the recognition that Germany was rearming prompted one flying enthusiast, Gérard Dellanger, to consider how civilian pilots like himself, who didn't qualify for the RAF on age or medical grounds, might be used to support the war effort. He suggested that a fleet of light aircraft, piloted by civilians, could be used for a variety of tasks, including transporting mail, injured soldiers and VIPs. Dellanger was the director of British Airways, and through his connections in government, he was given the job of bringing together the most experienced civilian pilots of the day. In September 1939, the Air Transport Auxiliary was born.
They started off in Bristol with a nucleus of 30 British Overseas Airways pilots and the ATA old people, the over 25s.
I was a young chap, about 27 or 28, something like that. And you had to say, what am I going to do? And I obviously wanted to fly if at all possible. I quickly found out there wasn't a hope with the RAF. I wore glasses, and that ruled it out. I learnt about the existence of ATA, it must have been the summer of 39.
Peter offered his services and was invited for a test flight at Whitchurch Aerodrome on the outskirts of Bristol. At the time, Whitchurch had become the wartime base of British Airways operations, so it seemed a logical place for Delanger to set up the ATA.
My wife and I just drove down and reported. I was given a 10-minute flight by Macmillan, who was the test pilot for ATA, and I was told that I would do.
On the 3rd of September, the day war was declared, the ATA began operations. The private pilots who assembled were a mixed bunch. They included farmers, doctors, bank managers and publicans, alongside seasoned First World War fighter pilots who had honed their skills performing dogfights in canvas biplanes. Journalist Keith Jopp wore the scars of these encounters.
Keith Jopp was a real oddity because he had only one eye, only one arm, and he had certain other masculine shortages as well. But he was always cheerful, always determined to get his hand on any airplane he could, and he made it work.
Such was the volume of work that the ATA needed all the qualified pilots it could get, so Jopp wasn't the only pilot in its ranks with disabilities.
I was a very young cadet, heard a row going on in the common room, and I peeped round the door, and there were these two one-arm pilots waving their respective arm about, having a tremendous set to about which arm it was better to have to be able to fly, or not to have to be able to fly.
In the early days, I'm quite sure that we were looked upon as very odd fish indeed, and I'm sure the RAF were very alarmed at their lovely airplanes being put in the hands of these wild amateurs who really didn't know what to do.
Initially conceived as an aerial communication service, the ATA's mission soon changed to one of ferrying service aircraft to frontline squadrons, a job previously done by the RAF. The only problem was the limited numbers of qualified pilots. Most male pilots with the requisite 250 flying hours had already been approached, and so it was decided to open up the ATA to women, due largely to the campaigning of veteran pilot Pauline Gower. But the move sparked much controversy.
Well, I suppose today you wouldn't understand it, because women are doing the same thing as men all around. But in those days you didn't. I mean, women, delicate creatures, you know, you've got to be looked after. And the idea of them being an equal of men as flying was a bit revolutionary. The diehards at the Air Ministry and the politicians took a bit of convincing, I think.
But they weren't the only ones who needed convincing.
Everyone was trying to say, you can't do it, you know, women are no good, you must be kept at the kitchen sink. And Charles Gray wrote in The Airplane, women should be kept at the kitchen sink, you know, having babies.
And he wrote a letter to his paper saying, you know, it's too stupid of women to think they can go and fly bombers when they don't even know how to scrub a floor properly or make their husband's dinner, you know, that sort of attitude. And so there we are. I mean, husbands can look after themselves sometimes, can't they?
These women are in the news at home because they've undertaken a somewhat unusual war job, and their work is to ferry new aircraft of the Royal Air Force from factory to aerodrome.
Well, the first 8 who came in were exceptional women, and they'd done a lot of flying by those days, you know, many hundreds of hours.
They included a skiing instructor, an international ice hockey player and a ballet dancer. Several were mothers, and one was a grandmother. This was the first time in history that women would be officially employed to ferry military aircraft, and their appointment, not surprisingly, attracted a lot of media attention.
They were all society beauties, a lot of them, and really beautiful they were too. They used to call them the powder puff or something, and they hated it because they're not like that, you know.
At 20, Jackie Moggridge was the youngest pilot to enter the ATA, and her youthful looks sometimes caused problems.
I'm told I looked about 12. I didn't think so, but, you know, everyone else did. And I went to pick up a mosquito, and with my little chit, and the engineering officer was about 6'4", and he came up to me and he said, "Are you supposed to be the pilot taking my aircraft that I've been working on for 2 weeks? I'm not having any schoolgirl fly that aircraft," he said. "It's only made of wood. You'll smash it the first." So I said, "Excuse me, this is my permission." And I showed him my permission. He wouldn't believe me. He had to ring up Home Command. I made him ring up Home Command and get the clear, you know.
The first women pilots were based at Hatfield Aerodrome, just north of London, but their preparations for ferrying were rudimentary, to say the least.
In 1940, we had no training. We had to pass an exam at Bristol on the Tiger Moth. We were sent there to do one circuit.
The new women pilots were initially tasked with the unenviable job of delivering Tiger Moths to RAF training bases in Scotland. To rekindle memories of those gruelling flights, let us join Tiger Moth pilot Bob Gibson for a look at his vintage aircraft.
Very clear in my mind.
Does it bring back memories looking inside?
I remember it.
I must admit, I still have trouble working out how to use that compass.
Oh, lovely. I adored those compasses.
And navigating cross-country in an open cockpit when you're used to a modern aeroplane is really quite different.
It's all so different, isn't it?
Quite different.
Oh, absolutely different. Now everybody has GPSs and things.
Can you remember the first time that you flew a Tiger Moth, and have you got any particular memories of flying the aeroplane?
One of the standard jobs was to take one from Hatfield to, I think, Lossiemouth, mostly. And that took about at least two or three stops.
Did you plan in advance where you were going to land, or was it a matter of
well,
seeing how
you
far
decided.
you got?
There was nobody to plan for. I mean, you planned it yourself.
Right.
And
did you have to let them know you were coming?
You couldn't.
Or you just
there was no
turned
means.
up?
There was no means, no.
Yeah.
Not in those days.
And sometimes it used to take more than a day to get there.
Oh gosh, always. You'd never get to Lossiemouth in one day.
One of the trips we did, there were 5 of us taking Tiger Moths all the way from the south, all the way up to Prestwick. At, 70 miles an hour, that's a long way, and you had to land several times to refuel. And they told me, now, we haven't got enough maps, we've got one map, and the leader will have that map.
I used to sort of call it a gaggle, like a sort of gaggle of geese, I suppose. And we did, which was horrible, really, because you never really wanted to do what everybody else did. We used to go up far, Carlisle, and then fly up the Nith Valley to Prestwick.
A good view was vital for ATA pilots. With no radio communications and sometimes no map, one of the greatest challenges was simply finding your way around the country. Flying below the clouds, within sight of the ground, the pilots built up a mental image of the countryside, looking for landmarks as signposts en route.
There was no radios in our aeroplanes, and if there was, it wasn't sort of fitted up. So one just had to literally draw a line on your map and then fly on the regular, on the course on it. And just hope that the railway lines came up at the right time in the right place, which they didn't always, of course, and that was awkward.
And you had to literally follow roads or railways more often, look out for rivers and know whereabouts where they joined up there would be an airport you'd get to. So it really was an entirely personal hedge-hopping operation.
I think flying with the doors down makes it more drafty.
In May 1940, the German army invaded France, and the British Expeditionary Force was driven back to the Channel coast. To help slow the German advance, ATA pilots ferried aircraft out to frontline RAF airfields in Normandy, just days before the Allied evacuation of Dunkirk.
There was a call to take ferry battles out to France. This was when France was collapsing. But it was the first time I'd flown an aeroplane as big as a ferry battle. And we flew out to Châteaudun and landed. We were approached by the RAF flight sergeant and said, look, got 3 Hurricanes which we're going to burn because they're unairworthy. The engines work, but not much else. And if you'd like to fly them back, very welcome. Otherwise, the Germans will be here within 12 hours. So I was put into one. They put a loop of rope round the propeller, and he and another chap ran away as hard as they could, and the thing fired. I had no brakes, no hydraulics, and took off towards the sun. There was a thick haze, as I remember, and flying across the channel, there was no horizon. Managed to land up with the Needles in the Isle of Wight and onto White Waltham and landed. Slightly alarming landing because you couldn't put the flaps down except by pumping continuously. And of course, if you did that with one hand and you had to throttle the other hand, you had nothing for the stick, so you dodged it around. But anyway, we got down in one piece.
With the defeat of France, Hitler's next target was Britain, and on the 10th of July, the Battle of Britain began. This was a critical time for the ATA, and pilots worked increasingly long hours to keep their overstretched RAF colleagues supplied with fighting aircraft.
One bomb could damage a lot of aircraft, put them out of action. And if they're going to try, as they were trying to bomb the factories themselves, not only would they damage the factory and output there, but there are a lot of finished machines enough to equip a good many squadrons, just simply sitting there waiting to be used. And you must get them into the action, get to the maintenance units, have guns fitted, then they can supply the replacements for the squadrons, who I suspect were jolly short of aircraft then.
But despite the dangers of enemy aircraft, it was actually the unpredictable nature of the British weather that claimed most ATA lives.
Yes, I think the weather killed a lot of people who got caught out and didn't get away with it.
One of those who didn't get away with it was the ATA's highest profile recruit, the celebrated pre-war flying ace, Amy Johnson.
It was in 1930 that Amy Johnson electrified the world by her daring solo flight to Australia. And this was only the beginning of a series of bold and brilliant efforts which justly earned for her the title of the world's greatest woman flyer.
Her solo flying achievements and the records set with her husband and fellow ATA pilot, Jim Mollinson, meant that Amy was never out of the limelight. Her fame may have been good for ATA publicity, but for her it brought many personal pressures.
She was old for that time. She was in her very late 30s, and she was very insecure, in my opinion.
And she was doing taxi work for us, you know, picking up 8 or 9 pilots, putting them in with their parachute, taking them to the next place, and then they would take off from there and so on.
On the 6th of January 1941, Amy Johnson set off on a flying mission to deliver an Oxford from Prestwick to Kidlington, but encountered thick cloud and low-lying mist en route.
Each pilot had an Oxford to take from all over England to go to Kidlington. Amy was bringing hers from Scotland in Prestwick, and she landed at Blackpool to get a weather report. And they said to her, "Well, it's bad here, but you know, you'll be all right."
Well, I myself am pretty sure that she just got above cloud in bad weather when none of us were flying. It was a really bad day. And once you get out of sight of the ground, unless you can find a hole to come down through to see the ground, you know, there's no way back.
She must have felt absolutely desperate, you know, there was no gap in the clouds, obviously not knowing where she was.
And I was on duty, it must have been 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night, and a message came through that, I think it was an Oxford, I'm not sure, but had crashed in the Thames. And we chased around to find out who was overdue, and it was pretty obvious quite quickly that it was Amy Johnson.
I think she was in an Oxford, and you had to go to the back where the door was to get out of it. She managed to do that all right, but it was very cold, I think. And anyhow, the little naval vessel which went to pick her up, very difficult really to pick somebody up, actually, you know, out of the water. And they really got a bit close, and she got sort of caught into the propeller, I suppose.
She really was sweet. It absolutely broke my heart when I heard she died. I feel like crying now.
News of Amy's death reminded ATA pilots of the risks they faced ferrying aircraft across hostile winter skies.
In those days, there was no smoke abatement. In fact, the great thing was to produce as much muck as they could in the factories, so that the bombers, when they came over, couldn't see where to bomb. And we got far more fogs and sticky conditions, particularly in the Midlands, all around London for that matter, so that the conditions are ones that you wouldn't meet nowadays at all.
It was intense. I mean, you hardly ever saw a place like Sheffield, except if there was half a gale blowing. And so consequently, it used to mix in with the weather and pull the clouds down and so on. And a lot of the time, it was like flying inside a used milk bottle.
Poor weather conditions severely limited flying, leading to a backlog of aircraft which needed to be moved from the factories. Like sitting ducks on the tarmac, the Air Ministry was concerned they could be bombed before they'd even flown.
There was a cabinet minute passed that aircraft which were collecting and not being moved from Castle Bromwich, I think there were 200 of them, with 200 operational Spitfires was several squadrons. And a squadron was a very valuable unit in the RAF. I simply arrived then and was told to get the aircraft out of Castle Bromwich in particular.
From the top level, we had orders that the Spitfires had to be moved. But you know, how we sort of did it without breaking our necks, I don't know.
With the end of the Blitz, the RAF went fully on the offensive, and the ATA needed even more pilots to meet an increasing need to ferry bombers and fighters. In the next programme, we meet these new recruits and discover how the ATA met the daunting challenge of training civilian men and women to fly every type of service aircraft, from fighters to huge four-engine bombers like Lancasters and Stirlings.
If we'd have had radio, we couldn't have done it, because if we'd have had outside interference, if you haven't got radio, they can't say no.
I was flying a Typhoon south of the Reading Railway. Suddenly there was an enormous bang, and I thought, oh, the engine's blown up. I looked down, and there was no floor. The entire floor of the Typhoon had gone, and all I could see was the wires of the controls between my feet.
Oh, Ancient and Tired Airman was the ordinary name for ATA. And in the early days, I'm quite sure that we were looked upon as very odd fish indeed.
As much as they labelled the pilots of the Air Transport Auxiliary as being ancient and tired airmen, the RAF relied on their civilian cousins to keep them supplied with planes throughout the war. Between them, the men and women pilots of the ATA flew over 308,000 missions, in which they would ferry any one of over 100 different types of aircraft, from factories to front-line squadrons.
1941 brought an increased tempo in aircraft production.
From small beginnings at Whitchurch Aerodrome near Bristol, the ATA had by now established ferry pools across Britain. But with 1,500 new planes being produced each month, the organisation was stretched to its limit, and the call went out for more ferry pilots. A number were recruited from the RAF on attachment. Some were transferred for operational reasons, and some for other reasons.
I was posted to Rise Norton, where I demolished one of His Majesty's Oxford aircraft one black night, and it broke up like a box of cornflakes. And from there on in, that led to the RAF saying, well, you're getting a bit expensive. And they said, do you mind leaving?
I joined the RAF as soon as the war started almost, although I was almost too young. But right from the word go, I wanted to fly Spitfires like a child. As I had a word with quite a few people in the RAF, higher up boys, and it was obvious that the only way to get to fly a Spitfire was to get into this ATA thing. And so I managed by various means to get out of the RAF and get into ATA.
I mean, one of the things he's supposed to have done was to land a Blenheim on the Norfolk beach, because he completely lost. He didn't know whether he'd gone or anything. Apparently he tramped inland and he came across some old boy and Johnny thought he was up in Scotland or something. He came across some old boy, and he said this. He said, "Have you got any idea where I am?" He says, "Yeah." He says, "You're on the Norwich Road."
Johnny Jordan later went on to build a successful brand of breakfast cereals. Whilst his current mode of transport is a little more sedate, he still turns up for work every day and has lost none of his zest for adventure and healthy disregard for the rule book. The independent culture of the ATA provided the perfect home for free spirits like Peter and Johnny, and soon after joining, Johnny found himself climbing into a Spitfire for the first time.
I was absolutely amazed by the ability of the Spitfire to do aerobatics, and I used to spend the whole time doing aerobatics until I felt ill myself.
He rolled a Warwick, which is something I wouldn't do if you paid me all the money in the world. You see, but I mean, he's that sort of person. But I mean, to get something like that upside down, close up to a lank, and get a picture, I mean, it makes your blood run cold. I mean, he could have collided with that lank, no trouble at all.
Despite the arrival of extra pilots from the RAF, there was still a backlog of aircraft. To address this problem, Lord Brabazon, the new Minister for Aircraft Production, campaigned for women to be allowed to fly the same planes as their male colleagues, including the most powerful fighters of the day.
My first one came, I'd gone up to Dumfries with an Oxford or something, and I rang Prestwick, which was what you normally did, and said, "Have you got anything that I can to get home in?" And they said, "Oh, we've got a Hurricane that wants to come up from here." And I said, "But I don't know that I'm cleared to fly them." And he just said, the operations just said, "Oh, women are cleared to fly them now." And you see, you didn't dare say no. So I had to, go down and get into the blasted thing and take it.
Training civilian pilots to fly every type of service aircraft was a huge undertaking, and one that had never been attempted before. To achieve its objective, the ATA established its own flying conversion school, where pilots could learn to fly the different types of single, twin and four-engine aircraft they might encounter whilst ferrying. It was impossible for pilots to learn to fly every one of the 147 types of aircraft in service, so planes were organised into different classes, and training was given on one or two types in each class. Class 1 were single-engined light aircraft, used for training like the Tiger Moth. Class 2 were single-engined fighter aircraft like Spitfires. Class 3 were twin-engined light aircraft such as Oxfords. Class 4 were also twin-engined aircraft, mostly medium-sized bombers like the Mosquito. Class 5 were four-engined aircraft like the Lancaster, and Class 6 were flying boats like the short Sunderland. Peter George visited the Imperial War Museum's aircraft collection at Duxford to reacquaint himself with some of the aircraft he ferried.
Basically, all aircraft fly with the same sense. You push the stick to go down, you pull it to go up, you turn the wheel or put the stick to the right and to the left, and the rudder the same. So basically they're all made to do the same thing. The only thing is the different characteristics of any particular aircraft.
Peter is particularly familiar with the specific characteristics of Lancaster KB-889, for on the 28th of January 1945, he ferried it from Kidlington to Aston Down. But unlike his fellow RAF pilots, who benefited from months of intensive training, the first time Peter ferried a Lancaster, all he had was a small book of notes to assist him.
If you were flying the aircraft the first time, you'd use the ferry pilot's notes, which were an absolute magic compilation of all you needed to know to fly every aircraft that came before you. And you'll see here on this particular page, it will give you the details of the starting procedures, undercarriage operations, flaps. And with the aid of this little book, which is a work of art, it meant to say that you climb into an aircraft that you'd never seen before and fly them, hopefully safely, from A to B.
Pilots were also taught a mnemonic, a list of safety checks for whatever type of aircraft they were in.
HTT, MPP, FGG, FUSD.
H was hydraulics, I think.
Throttle, trim, M, mixture.
Petrol, flaps.
Gills, gauges, unlock controls.
Supercharger, tail wheel lock. And then you can take off.
Hydraulics, throttle tension, trim, gauges. Exactly the same on a jumbo jet. You push to go and pull to slow down. I mean, quite truthfully, I can see that the hangar doors are open. And if I had half a chance, I'd start the blessed thing up and take it off.
But even with the aid of mnemonics and their ferry pilot notes, the pressure of moving so many different types of aircraft meant it was inevitable that pilots would get into the odd bump and scrape.
Yeah, I picked this spit up from Prestwick. It was my very first spit, actually. And I shouldn't really have been flying it because the weather conditions weren't suitable. But I thought to myself, well, I'd waited 2 days, and I thought to myself, well, I better get cracking. And of course, I got over Kirkbride and forgot to put the wheels down.
Ambulance and crash wagon stand by. Aircraft crash landing.
I knew something was wrong when I hit the runway because the prop came, all the blades shot off the prop. I wasn't very popular for that, I can tell you.
I think my last job of the day was the Typhoon, to bring it back to Langley for overhaul. And it was a lovely day, lovely afternoon. And I got to Langley, and it had balloons around it, like all the factories did. And I was coming in south to north, and I looked at the windsock and I thought, no, it'd be better the other way. And I was just going around the airfield, and the engine died on me. And I couldn't turn in to the airfield because of the balloons. So I had to go on round, and it didn't, it stopped altogether. So I had to crash land it by the railway, by Langley. I must have been turned sideways because I laid my head on that side and leg and everything. And an ambulance came out and they took me to the hospital. I got out myself, walked up to the desk and said, will you sew up my head?
Lettice walked away from her crash landing, but some people weren't so lucky.
We were flying back in this Mosquito from the north, and we were going to Lasham. And we were approaching a very big snowstorm, and so, of course, we couldn't talk to each other. And as we approached this thunderhead, I turned around, because I had a lot of experience by then, and I turned around, went around it, and it took a lot longer. But I knew I'd get icing and probably an engine cut with the 2 twin engines. So when we eventually got there, when I got to Lasham and I was on the approach, I saw this big black patch right in the middle of the runway. And I thought, God, what's that, And after I landed, it was my friend. She went through the storm, obviously had icing, and they stalled, and it was just burnt, an explosion, all made of wood, and they were killed outright. All I saw was the black remains of that. There was nothing there. It was all burnt out.
As with other services, dealing with the death of colleagues or loved ones became a regular reality for many ATA pilots.
You lost a lot of people in your among your colleagues, and you just went on. I think the worst part was VE Day. Me, anyway, I sort of just felt this awful desolation. And, it's silly that it still makes you feel like that.
In October 1941, the ATA opened a new ferry pool at Hamble, close to the Spitfire factory at Eastleigh on the south coast. Just like other ferry pools, the pilots would gather each morning to learn what needed delivering and to where. But there was one major difference about this ferry pool.
Hamble was an all-women's pool. And when I heard I was being posted there, I thought, how awful, being posted to a pool, no fellows, only girls. In fact, it was a wonderful pool.
To me, it was rather unpopular because it was rather like being back at girls' school. You see, the older ones, the 1940 ones, were now thought to be sort of to look after and bring on the younger ones, because there were younger ones coming through then. And so it was really rather like a sort of boarding school again.
Well, where we were flying, people, very often in the Anson took their knitting, and that always seemed to surprise everybody. And the Anson was very often taken off quite fully loaded, and it was necessary to get the tail up as soon as possible. So those sitting at the back, everybody was urged to move forward, and people would sort of stop knitting, and everybody would, or reading or whatever, would move forward quite unconsciously, and they, look around, and the moment the thing was off, everybody go back again and start knitting again. But it tickled me. I thought it was quite funny at the time.
Everybody loved to fly, and they're given all those wonderful airplanes to fly, especially us who cleared 15 splits a day from Eastleigh. Been given all those wonderful airplanes to fly. What was wrong with that?
Many times I remember flying in Wellington with a hot water bottle on my tummy, because girls get pains once a month, and I was in agony. And I wasn't going to not fly. And I had this clumsy old Wellington, and then the man said, "What's this here? Is it a hot water bottle?" One of the engineers. I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, it's mine, yes." He said, "You're not flying with a hot water bottle, it's summer." Of course, I hadn't the heart. I couldn't tell him why, I had a tummy ache.
And when the weather was bad, and we used to play bridge, and then other people did the Times crossword, people cut out their clothes and sewed them up and things like that. I used to make gloves, because I found I used to always be hurting my fingers.
Hamble, like the other ferry pools, was home to pilots who had travelled great distances to fly for the organisation. Maureen de Pop honed her flying skills in the open grasslands of southern Argentina, where her father managed a vast sheep station. Like many expats, she returned to her mother country on the outbreak of war and offered her services as a pilot.
I always wanted to fly, apparently, from when I was a child. My father said I nearly broke my nose jumping off a big embankment, waving my hand, saying I'm going to fly when I saw a bird do it. But my father had always held very strong views about people not fighting in the Great War. He said everybody should go on. My mother was very worried, but he said, no, I think it is your job, and I think if you want to go, you can. And they tried to arrange it.
Drawn together by a common language, Maureen befriended another pilot from South America, known to her friends by the name of her mother country, Chile.
Chile didn't know any English when she came to England, so she was put to work in the hangar with the mechanics. And so her English was mechanics' English, really.
I gather she learnt a lot of very bad language from them, and because she'd come up with the most extraordinary expressions, English, and she did a good job, enough to be able to come back and do the course and be a ferry pilot.
One of the most successful aspects of the ATA was its ability to mould pilots from many different nations into an efficient air force. Along with Maureen and Chile, there were Poles, Czechs, Spanish, and recruits from the US and the Commonwealth. In total, pilots from 26 countries joined the organisation, all sharing a common bond, the universal love of flying. Despite the ATA's cosmopolitan makeup, it was inevitably the achievements of women pilots that really caught the public's imagination. One story that attracted a great deal of media attention was when Lettice Curtis became the first woman pilot to fly 4-engine bombers.
You flew so many Halifaxes and you could fly a Stirling. Well, the Lanc was much of the easiest of the lot. You could fly a Lanc. And then I think so many nose-wheel aircraft you can fly a Liberator. I mean, with no training at all.
I only had one Liberator, and really it flew me. I don't remember actually anything about it much. I sort of sat there, and it just kind of took off and got me back again.
By March 1943, the ATA were ferrying thousands of aircraft every month. Their efforts were rewarded with a visit from Sir Stafford Cripps, MP for Bristol and Minister of Aircraft Production.
That the people of this country should know and understand the contribution that the ATA has made and is making to our war effort.
So impressed was he with the work of the men and women pilots of the ATA that he recommended that women should be paid the same as their male colleagues.
And he realised that we were taking the same risks, doing the same work, and yet only paid 2/3 of what the men were. And then he decided, well, it should be equal pay.
Embracing sexual equality made the ATA unique in wartime Britain, setting a precedent that other larger employers would take years to equal. Not that the ATA was a small organisation anymore. It now operated from 16 ferry pools around the country, with over 600 pilots, more than the RAF had at the beginning of the war. But more were needed, and it fell to Peter Marcel, the new head of training and recruitment, to find them.
We got to a point where we couldn't get enough pilots, and the policy decision was made to say we must train ab initio. And that caused quite a lot of problems, because who do you ask, who do you find, what criteria do you use to find somebody who would be suitable? Clearly they weren't service people. People who were able to go to the services were ruled out straight off. And therefore a good many of them would be women.
The term ab initio means from the beginning, and for Joy Lofthouse, a former bank clerk from Cirencester, becoming a pilot was a case of starting from scratch.
I saw an advertisement in the aeroplane that said ATA were recruiting people with no flying experience at all. Of course, I was very interested in flying because in this part of the world we're surrounded by airfields, and most of my first boyfriends had been RAF pilots. I'd never been in an aeroplane, probably seen a few at the air days that they had. But it was knowing so many RAF pilots that gave me an interest in flying.
Clearly they had to be fairly young and adaptable and quick to pick up. And the only standards we could think of was that certainly they could drive a car and were happy with mechanical things like that. And the other thing which I was very keen on was that they should be able to ride a horse and adapt and cope with the problems of a strange animal.
And they were looking for coordination, obviously. And then one came back and hoped, and I got a letter to say, yes, I had been accepted.
The medical went off all right, but you were supposed to be 5'4", and I was 5'2 3/4. And he kept urging me, saying, can't you grow a little taller? And I, honest to the last, was saying, no. So in the end, he wrote down what he found in his mumbo-jumbo and never told anybody what it meant, you see, so they didn't know. And which is one way I got in.
In the final programme, we learn how the ATA played its part in the build-up to invasion and transported people and supplies all over the continent after D-Day. We also discover what happened to these brave ATA pilots after the war.
Some of the biggest risks of flying with the ATA was the fact that pilots were flying an aircraft they'd never flown before, from the many diverse types of aircraft there were.
ATA, you had to make your own decisions. In the Air Force, you never made the decision whether or not you were going to fly. You were told, you fly today.
Everything sort of comes by stages, and we were the pioneers of women flying, I suppose.
During the Second World War, the vital task of supplying aircraft to the Air Force and the Royal Navy fell to the civilian men and women pilots of the Air Transport Auxiliary. By early 1944, aircraft were being moved from the factories to bases at a rate of 2,400 a month. In preparation for the planned invasion of Europe, No. 1 ferry pool at White Waltham near Reading and No. 9 at Aston Down near Stroud were designated as invasion ferry pools, providing support to squadrons preparing for D-Day. Don Hoare and Eric Viles were both stationed at Aston Down. Even though much has changed in the intervening years, a visit to the airfield brings back vivid memories.
I always describe the number 9 ferry pool at Aston Down as being a drab hut on a West Country airfield, miles away from anywhere. And that's basically what it was. Well, this brings back a few memories, doesn't it, of the old airfield?
Yeah, it was 60 years ago when we first came here. And you remember when they had all the squadrons here preparing for D-Day, and they'd for mass formations.
That's right, yeah.
And they were,
Typhoons, tempests,
a lot.
You name it, a lot. And the Lancasters coming across from the MU.
Eric and Don's friendship, like many forged during the war, has stood the test of time.
Checks complete, yes.
All set to go?
Yes. I flew with Don on several occasions, probably 8 or 9 times, and we got on exceptionally well.
He would tell you that when he first knew me, he called me Sir because he was an air cadet and I was commissioned. Exactly the same way as when I first met Mara, she called me Sir, but that didn't last long.
One of the jobs I used to do when we were flying was to fly on the taxi Anson. So my job was to sit alongside the captain of the Anson and wind up the wheels. It was 112 turns, and that took some doing, I can assure you, because by the time we got the wheels up, it was time to wind them back down again. And I often used to wonder, was it worth the effort? But I'm sure it was. It saved a lot of fuel. My goodness me. There's the old air raid shelter.
Yes, over there. My goodness.
And then the hangar was the other side of those trees.
Yes, where we used to keep the Ansons.
That's right. And look at the poor old MT shed. Look at the state
dear,
it's
dear.
in. Let's have a look inside, see if there's anything left.
Ah. Goodness gracious me. I wonder whose kit this is.
Preparations for the D-Day invasion of Europe accelerated throughout the spring of 1944. They were meant to be secret, although everyone sensed that something big was about to happen. From the air, however, it was obvious to the ATA pilots at Hamble Ferry Pool that something was going on.
The South of England became a large aircraft carrier. All the aircraft were brought down from East Anglia and the north to do the invasion. So every aerodrome was solid.
No one was allowed into that coastal strip within about 10 miles of the south coast. But from the air, of course, one could see everything. You could see the build-up. The army vehicles were stacked up, tanks and carriers, right back in the New Forest, almost to Winchester. The landing craft were massed in the channel. You could have walked across them to the Isle of Wight.
We used to hear the little bits, the LCTs and the LCIs going down for a practice, and they'd go pop, 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 pop. They had this sort of engines, and they'd go down for about a quarter of an hour, they'd be back again. And we had this one evening, we were all sitting down eating, and we heard pop, 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 pop. And then we heard endless pop, 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 pops, just endless. And we all got up and said, my goodness, it's the invasion.
And then one morning we woke up and there was nothing in the river. And I had to ferry a bit far somewhere. And I flew off and there was nothing. All the trees were empty of people and tanks. And that was very moving, you know, to think of them all going over there and what was happening. Dead silence everywhere.
On June the 6th, 1944, D-Day landings began as the troops, landing craft and planes that the Hamble pilots had seen from the air forged a bridgehead on the Normandy coast. 6 months later, the ATA returned to Europe when 2 Hurricanes were ferried to an airfield near Dieppe from Aston Down.
The first ATA pilots, of course, to fly back into France was Hugh Burgo, the commanding officer, and Maurice Harley, the French pilot who was based with us.
Within a few weeks, the ATA commenced regular ferrying flights to Europe. As well as carrying out their traditional role of ferrying fighters and bombers to frontline squadrons, some pilots joined the Air Movement's flight section, taking on the task of moving people, injured soldiers and supplies all over the continent.
I did quite a number of flights when it was full of all kinds of things. It was loaded to the gun op very often that I had to go in through the emergency exit into the cockpit from the outside. And then they shut things down after I got in.
Some pilots, like Johnny Jordan, were recruited for special missions, including transporting high-ranking German officers back to Britain for interrogation.
Well, the people we were collecting were nearly all generals. Most of them were German Army or German Air Force. There was a chap called Vic Dries who I had with me, I used to call him my navigator, but he was completely useless as a navigator, but he was jolly good at telling them where to get off and that sort of controlling these people.
Johnny also rescued people from the countries the Nazis had occupied, landing on roads if there wasn't a nearby airstrip.
The only name I remember is this General Bor Komorowski, and he had 2 people under him who we brought back, and they got out of the concentration camp, and we had to pick them up at a certain time because it was all timed that they would be at this airfield at a certain time.
And apparently he saved their lives because they more or less pleaded with him. And he said, can you take us out of the country and so on? He said, and you know what Johnny's like. He said, yeah, all right, boy, get in.
But it wasn't only generals and vital supplies that the ATA pilots brought back from the continent.
Oh, I was very naughty on one occasion. I didn't take my parachute. I filled the parachute with bicycle tyres and with coffee. And with that, I flogged them in the black market. And then I bought myself an Omega watch, which was one of the last that I could trace in Brussels. And so that was my reward for that.
But I mean, Johnny brought a motorbike back from a BMW motorbike in an Henson.
A motorbike sidecar, I think it was, originally, but we took the sidecar off. Marvellous motorbike, and I always remember being very pleased with that and using it for several years afterwards, too.
By the spring of 1945, the Allies had crossed into Germany, and on the 7th of May, the Nazis signed an unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. The following day was declared VE Day, and hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets to celebrate the end of the war.
Well, when peace was declared, I had to take a mosquito from the south to Aldergrove in Ireland. But I didn't know peace. That was the day that the 1 o'clock news said we were now at peace. Well, I took off just before that. As soon as I landed, there were dozens of, all the engineers were there. And the first one picked me up and whizzed me around, and then the other one picked me up and whizzed me around, and I said, just a minute, I'm going to be sick. What's happening? Why are you whizzing me around? Peace has been declared. You can take that mosquito back. We don't want it.
I was just terribly relieved. Who wasn't that it was over, because the Japanese thing was still going on. And the work began to slow down, of course. But you could hardly wish the war to go on, could you? So that we could have lots of work.
Well, I was very wicked, really. I could have wished the war had gone on longer because I was enjoying myself so much, and I knew that I was doing a job and flying aircraft that I'd never fly again.
Great interest was shown by large numbers of visitors at the ATA pageant at White Waltham near Maidenhead.
To celebrate the tremendous achievements of these unsung travellers of the skies, the ATA staged a great air show in September 1945. Friends and families attended to see the many types of aircraft flown by the organisation, and heard Lord Beaverbrook, the former Minister for Aircraft Production, declare, "The ATA pilots were soldiers fighting in the struggle just as completely as if they had been engaged on the battlefront." And with that pat on the back, the ATA ceased all operations, disappearing as abruptly as it had arrived.
November 1945, the Air Transport Auxiliary just packed up, went home, and it's just as though it had never been.
But then, you see, after the war ended, they had their garden party, and then everybody clapped their hands and they all went home.
But isn't that rather a good thing? I mean, that's typical of the way these things work. There's no bureaucracy there to keep it going or to hang on to it, jobs and so on. They're all there for a specific job, and people jumped into fulfill that job in the early part of the war, and I think as soon as that job had finished, the high command, at least of ATA, said, well, there's no point in just carrying on this for the sake of it. Let's pack it up quick.
The 600 pilots of the ATA clocked up over 30 million air miles and carried out more than 300,000 aircraft movements during the war. Yet despite these tremendous achievements, many women found it particularly difficult to get jobs as pilots afterwards. Once again, it was men who were the first choice.
At the end of the war, there were hundreds of men leaving the Air Force, and they all wanted to fly again, those that weren't killed, that is. And so there was no earthly hope for a woman to get a job.
Then I answered an advertisement, this was about February 46, I said, for a test pilot job, which I thought of fun. And I don't know whether they made a mistake or something, but I didn't say miss, but I gave them lots of clues, like when I was at school and things. And there was a sort of usher, whatever you call him, outside showing people in to the boardroom. And he came to me and he said, this is for a job as a test pilot. I said, I know. And he went inside, and a shriek of laughter came out. I can remember that. And I suppose they had to see me, as I was on the list for them to see. And so, and I got first place on the reserve against all the RAF people. And then, of course, all hell broke loose in high places. We're not having a woman test pilot, blah, 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 blah. And, of course, they won in the end.
While some ATA pilots struggled to establish a post-war flying career, others, like Jackie Moggridge, joined the RAF Volunteer Reserve.
I was the only girl in the west of England to join the RAFER then. And the instructor said, I'm going to take you up in a Tiger Moth. I don't think they bothered to look at our logbooks. And this examiner took me up. He was an oldish man, a bit grumpy. So he said, all right then, let's see you fly straight and level. Let's see you do a gentle turn. Let's see you do this. All right, next time you come, we'll start climbing and gliding. And I didn't say a word. So we came down, and then he went and he said, right, I'll go and sign your logbook in then. And I had afternoon tea with my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, and my baby in the mess. I didn't realise you didn't do that sort of thing. They told me soon enough, after we'd had the tea, and then he came rushing back, and he was livid, this instructor. He said, how dare you? I said, I'm so sorry. Have I done something wrong? I thought he was going to tell me off for having tea there, but it wasn't that. He said, I've just looked at your logbook. You're an ex-ATA pilot, he said. You've got more hours than I'll ever experience in a lifetime. Why didn't you tell me? You made me feel such a fool, teaching you how to fly straight and level and doing this and doing that. What do I say? I can't say to him, I'm an ATA pilot, I wouldn't have dared. I spent my whole life apologising for my presence.
Despite her modesty, Jackie achieved great success as a commercial pilot. She ferried Spitfires to Burma and the Middle East, and later became the first British woman pilot to be employed as an airline captain.
Band, Banshin! Band, Bandbusters! Sound up!
Diana Bonato Walker may have allowed her own pilot's licence to lapse, but being on the ground hasn't lessened her commitment to encourage others to take to the skies.
I'm now president of the local Air Training Corps unit, which is at Red Hill, and it's a very strong unit. They've got about 70 or more young people there, who are wonderful young people, and they're all very keen and very smart.
Thank you very much, Fleet Sergeant. Stand the squadron at each, please.
Squadron, stand back! Ace!
Would you like to inspect your squadron?
Thank you very much. I think it's very important that the young should have a sense of history to look back on and to realise that you can do anything you want to do, especially if you want to.
Petrol on.
Living proof that age is no barrier to flying, Johnny Jordan has lost none of his wartime zest for adventure.
Contact. since the war, I've been going around doing aerobatics around all these air shows, and I'm Boeing steerman. When I get the opportunity, I go up and give it a blow around, but it's just really to keep my hand in, you know. I love aerobatics, doing aerobatics, that's good fun, and I used to try all of them.
Including doing the stunts in a Biggles film. Alongside stunt work, Johnny also used his steerman for crop spraying. That is, until one too many close encounters with a bridge.
Yeah, well, when you're crop spraying, you're flying 2 feet from the ground. So if you see a bloody great bridge anywhere, it's no problem to fly under the bridge, which I've always been inclined to do. And I got caught doing it once or twice, and the last time they got my number, somebody did. Also, the prop tips exceed the speed of sound, so it makes a hell of a row. And so I got done over that, and I had my licence taken away, which is very sad. The worst thing that's happened to me.
Losing his licence, aged 78, hasn't grounded him altogether, although now he has to take a qualified co-pilot with him whenever he has the urge to take to the skies.
And another terrible thing is I just didn't realise I was so old until it was my birthday about a fortnight ago. Since then I've said to myself, you know, you're bloody 82, and I just can't get used to it at all. But it's absolutely frightening when you suddenly realise you are 82.
What do you mean?
Look like? Bloody awful.
Well, you know what they say?
What?
Any landing's a good one as long as you can walk away from it. Do you think we'd make film stars?
Oh, no, I think it's highly doubtful.
Stardom may have passed them by, but the spirit of the ATA still burns bright in the remaining veterans who get together for a memorial flight at RAF Lynham each year.
We spent our formative years, if you like, in ATA, and the friendships we made then meant a lot to us because we were all doing the same job, certain amount of danger, and it's very nice to go back to the reunions and see some of them every year and count up the ones who are still coming and who can't anymore. But yes, it means a lot to me to keep in touch with the few of us that are left.
There's no doubt about it that ATA affected my life in the days during the war so much that I still see those days clearly today. It made such an impression on me. I lost some very good friends during that period I was serving. I'll never forget them.
One place where they are never forgotten is the ATA Association's annual reunion, where veterans, their families and modern-day RAF officers celebrate the ATA's wartime achievements.
And I always did and always will salute your ability, your adaptability, your flexibility and your courage in doing the things that you did.
ATA should be remembered as a unique organisation that made a great contribution to this country in World War II. It was a sort of organisation in many ways you always hoped would go on, but of course it didn't.
I don't think so quickly. I don't do anything so quickly. I'm really an old codger. And that, yet, as I did say once before, even old birds fly. So there's nothing to stop me flying if somebody give me an aeroplane.
It was the happiest time of my life because as a pilot we were free to do what we wanted to do because that was what I call heaven flying.
Sadly, Jackie Moggridge passed away a few months after filming. For such a free spirit, whose life was so closely bound up with being in the skies, a memorial flight has been organised to scatter her ashes from the wings of a Spitfire she ferried during the war.
And I read a book once called Anyone Can Do Anything, and I thought, well, I'll try. My mother took me up for a flight when I was 14. Oh, and I nearly died of fright. I was terrified. And my mother said, you can't be a pilot, dear, if you're frightened just going up as a passenger. I said, yes, I am. I'm going to be a pilot.